Oh, hello. Namaskar. Tashidili. Good morning to our friends in the United States and good afternoon, our friends in Europe. Good evening in New Delhi and good late evening, our friends in Taiwan, in Tokyo, in Australia, etc. So today we are going to discuss a very unfortunate development subject, that why there are our initial title was why there are more than 150 self-immolations in Tibet. And after we planned this webinar, unfortunately, two self-immolations happened immediately after that. One was on 27th of February in Lhasa, in front of Potala, where a young Tibetan musician of 25 years, he committed self-immolation. And exactly 1 month after that, on 27th of March, an 81-year-old Tibetan in Ngaba, which is famous for Kirti Monastery in Sichuan, he committed self-immolation. Unfortunately, in both cases, uh, the victims died. We pay our homage to them, and with these two self-immolations, unfortunately, the total number comes to 160 self-immolations by Tibetans inside Tibet since 2009. So this itself speaks of the indifference of world community. It speaks of the Chinese arrogance, but more than both of these things, this speaks of the determination of Tibetan people for the freedom of their country. So before we start, we salute those martyrs. We admire their spirit, but feel sad that they had to take this extreme step. And so today we have, uh, I'll first give you introduction of the two organizing organizations. One is the Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement. In short, it is CHASE. And the other is Tibetan Youth Congress. CHASE is a think tank and a platform for discussion among scholars, among political activists, and various researchers, advocacy groups who have keen interest in the Himalayan region, the countries in and around Himalayas. And we organize webinars on various issues related to this region. And then we have Tibetan Youth Congress, TYC, which everybody knows is the largest and oldest socio-political organization of Tibetan diaspora. And currently it is the third generation of Tibetan youths who were born in exile in India, who are leading TYC. And as we know, TYC has proven to be a very successful nursery of Tibetan leadership in exile. And we have seen that young people, boys and girls who in a way passed out of Tibetan Youth Congress, later on they have taken over the leadership of Tibetan community, and they have reached positions up to the what you call the prime minister or president of Tibetan Central Tibetan administration. So TYC and Chase, welcome all of you. To give a very short, to continue this small background about this subject, that now when we are meeting, at least 160 known cases of self-immolations have happened in Tibet since 2009. And we know the case as it happened a few years ago in Middle East. That was when one shopkeeper in Tunisia committed self-immolation. At that time, I think more than a dozen countries saw uprising, the Arabian uprising, because the world could not take the shock of self-immolation by a brave man from Tunisia. And we know the case of the monk who in 1963 committed self-immolation in Saigon. And the result was that the world's biggest power, America, had to finally vacate South Vietnam. So it's that much of world attention these self-immolations attracted. But it's very unfortunate that there have been 160 self-immolations so far in Chinese occupied Tibet. And still, the world governments, whether it is the governments of different countries or respected organizations like United Nations, human rights, various groups who claim that they are custodians of human rights and rule of law in the world, unfortunately, they are keeping silent. And that, I think, does not speak well of the honesty of word community. But anyhow, this is the background to what we are talking today. So we have three experts with us who will be sharing who are experienced in their own field. We have Mr. Marco Respinti. He is from Milano, Italy. He is director in charge of Bitter Winter, which is a magazine on religious liberty and human rights. It's a daily magazine on religious liberty. And he's a well-known watcher of China. And this magazine is published in English, Chinese, Italian, French, German, Spanish, Japanese, and Korean. You know, and he's a professional journalist and an independent researcher. He as essayist also, and he lectures on various issues related to religion and human rights. And he has been senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal since 1996. And also since 2007, he has been the founding member and board member of the Vandenberg Society for European Renewal in Hague. So welcome, Marco, to our webinar. And then we have Mr. Tenzin Lekshe. He is a very well-known Tibetan who is the spokesperson of the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala. Many of us call it the government in exile of Tibet. And he has been, before taking this responsibility, Tenzin Lekshe has been executive director of Tibet Policy Institute, which is a leading think tank of Tibet in Dharamsala. And my personal association with started from New Delhi when he has been the coordinator at India-Tibet Coordination Office in New Delhi, and also as a media coordinator with the Bureau of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in New Delhi. Today he is not feeling well for last 3-4 days. He is not keeping good health, but it's very kind of you, Tenzin Lekshe. You decided to come to this webinar. And of course, we'll also respond with equal friendship. We'll give you first chance to speak, and then if you feel it's necessary, you take a decision about whether you stay with us or you want to take rest. And then we have another prominent Tibetan, a Canadian Tibetan, Ladon Tethong. Ladon Tethong is a very well-known political activist, and she is co-founder of the director of Tibet Action Institute, and she has been the former executive director of Students for a Free Tibet, SFT, which is world famous organization which is actively working in universities across the world, and has been a leading group to bring awareness about the Tibetan issue across the world, especially the budding leadership of the world. So welcome, Ladon Tethong, to our show. And then I hope we will have Mr. Gompo Dhundup, the president of Tibetan Youth Congress, who is a co-host of this webinar. But suddenly he had to make some travel. So let us hope he can join before he starts his travel. But if he can't join, I think we will understand his his limitations. And then we have Professor Ayushi Ketkar, who is an international expert in international relations and security matters. She's a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, our old colleague in these webinars in this series. And she will handle question and answer session after our three speakers have completed their presentations. So let us start with uh, Mr. Tenzin Lekshe, who is, as I said, spokesperson of the Central Tibetan Administration and who has been following situation inside Tibet and outside Tibet very keenly for last so many years. So welcome, Tenzin Lekshe.
Thank you, Vijayji. Thank you for giving this opportunity to speak about this very important issue which is happening right now inside Tibet. So let me begin uh, with the testimony of one of two of the self-immolators who both died in 2012. The suffering of Tibetans without basic human rights is far worse than the suffering that we endure when we set ourselves on fire. So this gives a very clear understanding about what is really happening inside Tibet. In fact, now Vijayji, you have mentioned about 160. As per the official record, we have 158 verified self-immolations which has taken place since 2009. And out of them, you see 26 of them are below 18, very young. Yesterday, when His Holiness met with the participants of Shodan festivals and the participant of the Tibetan Middle Way conference, His Holiness make a very important remarks, which says that the Tibetan cause is not about one generation. It's about one's nationality. It can go on and on and on. Right. So therefore, when you look at the self-immolation, even though the CTA always, since from the beginning, right, appealed to all the Tibetans not to resort to these drastic actions. But somehow the prevailing situation is such that they have to take the extreme sacrifice for the cause of Tibet. Right. For that, we pay our respects to all those self-immolators, to their parents, to their family members, right, for their sacrifice for the cause of Tibet. And now, when you look at the self-immolation, why it happens, right, there were many questions. There were many things which we need to talk about. The first thing is, how do China perceive Tibet? What do China think about Tibet? What are the policies which they implement on Tibet so far for the last 60 years or 70 years, so-called? But they've been the oppressor, the occupied Tibet, and they have formulated their policies inside Tibet, but which are belligerent, which are not benevolent. And in a nutshell, we can say that whatever Chinese policy inside Tibet is, they only focus on Tibet, but not for the people, Tibetan people. Right. The Tibetan people, their sentiments, their aspirations, right, their culture, values, identity, everything has been crushed. But they just need Tibet. And they think that for the party's rule in Tibet, the Tibetan culture and Tibetan identity are the fundamental challenges. When they believe that, right from the beginning, when they believe that the Tibetan culture and Tibetan identity is a threat, the imminent threat for the party's rule, then how will they perceive, how will they look into the aspirations of Tibetan people? So therefore, the Chinese way of thinking and the policies and the perceptions, when you look at those things inside Tibet, was all about intolerance, it's all about arrogance, it's about chauvinism, right? which do, which curtails the Tibetan culture and the society. Back in 50s, when you look at the Panchen Lama's 70,000 character petitions, since then, the Panchen Lama was categorized or labeled as a class enemy. And the petition, right, which was supposed to talk about the Tibetan sentiments and the aspirations, were called as a poison arrow. And since then, China has been consistently assaulting the Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan language, Tibetan identity, Tibetan environment, and they've been demonizing His Holiness over and over again and again and again. So therefore, when China tried to demonize His Holiness, which is the epitome of our civilizations, of identity, and there was a huge reference inside Tibet, then it hurts the people's sentiments. Inside Tibet, whether you are young or whether you are old, there was a huge reverence and faith on His Holiness. If you look at the recent self-immolation, right, the 81-year-old Teshpatullah, when he celebrated his 80th birthday last year, what did he say? That gives a clear answer to the Chinese government what the Tibetans really want. On his 80th birthday, he said that since the sun of happiness will certainly shine over Tibet with the blessings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, young Tibetans should not lose hope, lose heart. So therefore, it is very important for the Chinese leaders to understand what Tibetan people really need, what Tibetan people really want, and what Tibetan people really deserved as being a Tibetan. So therefore, the Chinese government over the years, for 50, 60 years, they were in dilemma, they were confused. They always try to be the oppressor, but by not looking into what Tibetans really want. So in that case, in certain times, they said that you have to kill the servant's head over and over and again, right? And also, they also imply to generate more Chinese immigrants inside Tibet. They want to call upon more and more Chinese settlers inside Tibet, so that the Tibetan culture, Tibetan identity, the uniqueness of Tibetan culture, language, identity, everything gets assimilated. The assimilation policy, right, has been going on for over years. The Chinese settlers are marching inside Tibet, taking away all the economic opportunities, and by transforming it into a Chinatown, any other Chinatown. Just 5 days back, the Chinese government gave a report by saying that they are expecting around 61 million tourists in so-called Tibet Autonomous Region alone. 61 million tourists in 2025, targeting with the annual revenue of 10 billion US dollars. The exploitation of Tibet is very much there in the name of tourism. But that tourism, the name tourism, is a deceive. In the name of tourism, there are hundreds and thousands and millions of Chinese coming to settle in Tibet. Let me give you one document which they have presented. In 1994, document number 5 of the 6th enlarged plenary session of the Standing Committee of the 4th Congress of TAR branch of the Chinese Communist Party, issued on 5th September 1994, which encourages the Chinese migration. So over the years, there are millions and millions of Chinese coming into Tibet, and Tibet is becoming like a Chinatown. So therefore, as I said before, China wants Tibet, but not the Tibetan people. Just recently, again, China said that they are going to pump in 22 billion US dollars for 181 projects. What are the projects? Railway lines, airports, highways, dams, and border trade. And we don't know what border trade is about. It's about logistics, which can be of dual purpose for military reasons. So therefore, when you look at all these things, it will supplement Chinese migration into Tibet in a very advanced stage. Thereby, the Tibetan language, if you look at, I don't know, we'll talk about these issues. The Tibet Action Institute has recently come up with a report on the colonial school system inside Tibet. If you look at the monasteries, if you look at the Buddhism, the tradition which has been there since centuries, they've been labeled as a Chinese characterizations. Nowhere in the history of Tibet it was there. So there are so many things happening inside Tibet which needs attention. And the Tibetan people, over the years, they have done everything to save their identity and the culture. And this self-immolation, but in their belief, is the last resort to tell the truth. So let me give you one testimony again by Sonam Topkyal, male, 26 years old, who died after self-immolation protest on 9 July 2015. He said, since we do not have freedom to voice the truth about our condition, I have to sacrifice my life to be a witness of truth to the world in general, and specifically to the Chinese government and the people. So, with this regard, I strongly believe that the Chinese government cannot shut their eyes, shut their mouth, and close their ears. They can't. There may be more than 158, but because of the situation inside Tibet, the information is very strict to get out from Tibet. The foreign journalists and diplomats cannot go to Tibet. If you go to Tibet, you need a special permit to go to Tibet. So in this regard, the information flow is strictly maintained. And therefore, China cannot keep on doing this over and over and over again by putting pressures on the families with a strict diktat, by criminalizing all the family members of those who have self-immolated. We share the pain of all our brothers and sisters. We know that their voice cannot be raised, therefore they are voiceless in their own country. And we remain as the voice of those voiceless people. And we urge and we want the Chinese government to understand that we need to resolve this conflict. As long as the conflict remains, the problem will remain. So therefore, for the sake of our future, there should be a common ground where we should resolve the issue to move forward for the benefit of not just Tibetans and Chinese, but for all the humanity. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Tenzil Lekshila, for a very pointed presentation and the way you have explained how China is interested only in Tibet and not in Tibetan people or their culture or their identity, and how this policy of China of converting Tibet into a Chinese town has made life so difficult for Tibetans and driven them to so much frustration that finally they only find solace in expressing themselves through self-immolation. No, thank you very much for giving a very precise view of what is happening and why it is happening. I'm aware that you are not keeping good health for last 3 4 days, and but still you joined us. I am very thankful to you. Now I will leave it to you, depending upon your personal convenience. If you would, if you can stay with us, wonderful. Otherwise, if you can't, please make yourself comfortable and take rest. So thank you very much, Tenzin Lekshe, once again. Thank you. So now I will request Marco Respinti, who is a very well-known China watcher and who understands the religious environment in Tibet, China's policy on religion, and he is a very well-known spokesman of human rights of those people who can't express themselves or who need friends from across the world. So the floor is your, Marco. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vijay. And thank you very much to the kind organizer for inviting me to speak, as well to this distinguished fellow panelist who has just or will illuminate the profound question posed by our webinar today. I hope my Tibetan pronunciation will help me today, which is not very good. But Seven Norbu was a very popular Tibetan singer. Among other things, he reached fame as a competitor in the reality show Sing China, which is a paradox, given the fact that Norbu's country, Tibet, is not and has never been a part of China, but a country occupied by the totalitarian regime led by the Chinese Communist Party. Norbu died on February 25th, 2022 at 25 years, a few days before Losar, the Tibetans' New Year's Day. He set himself on fire outside the Potala Palace in Lhasa, the place of gods, the capital of Tibet. A month later, on March 27, an 81 years old man by the name of Tapun, a resident of Meruma nomadic village in Gaba County, now incorporated in China's Sichuan, died the same death in front of a police station near the Girtigompa Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Gaba County. The news of both these deaths were given by the Central Tibetan Administration, or CTA, or the Tibetan government in exile, Dharamsala, India. Only 3 more days elapsed, and on March the 30th, another Tibetan, Sering Samdup, set himself to fire. As well, as Radio Free Asia reported, near a police station not at long distance from a Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Kyengdo, in Yushul, Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture, and was immediately taken away by the authorities. 159 Tibetans are confirmed to have set themselves on fire since 2009. Another 10 have taken their lives in Nepal and India, where a large population of Tibetan exiles live. Radio Free Asia maintains an online, continually updated report for counting these victims, and I want to publicly acknowledge and thank my colleague and friend Ms. Tenzin Diki at Radio Free Asia for helping me moving through the Tibetan language of that document in preparation of today's webinar. Now, there is only one reason why so many Tibetans, many of whom are monks, kill themselves in this atrocious way, suffering tremendous pain. And this reason is the oppression and persecution they endure because of the CCP occupation of their country, abuse of their religious liberty, and cultural genocide. A book on the subject is very important, and my colleague at Bitter Winter, Italian sociologist Massimo Introvigne, reviewed it carefully. It is entitled Eat the Buddha, Life and Death in a Tibetan Town, published by award-winning American journalist Barbara Demick in 2020. It tells the story of Ngaba, the city which is the seat of Ngaba County, where old Tafun immolated himself on March the 27th this year. This is not by accident, and for 2 reasons. The first is that Ngaba is considered the world capital of self-immolations. The second is that Demick moved to China in 2007, specifically developing an interest in Tibet, visiting both the Tibet Autonomous Region and the Chinese provinces of Sichuan, Qinghai, Gansu, and Yunnan, which are part of historical Tibet. Her book focuses, in fact, on self-immolation. The fame of Ngaba city started on February 27, 2009, when a young monk from Kirti Monastery, Lobsang Tashi, nicknamed Tapei, set himself on fire to protest the Chinese harsh persecution of the peaceful demonstrations which took place in all Tibetan regions the year before. In fact, on May 10th, 2009, the 39th anniversary of the 1959 Tibetan uprising against the Chinese military occupation of Tibet, peaceful protests of monks and nuns started in Lhasa, followed by other spontaneous demonstrations in monasteries and throughout the entire Tibetan plateau until March the 25th, to a total of 150, according to the CCP Xinhua news agency. The severe repression by the Chinese police and the CCP's People Liberation Army didn't wait much. According to the Chinese government, 23 people were killed during the riots, but according to the CTA, they were instead 203, and according to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, they were up to 400. Foreign journalists were expelled. Amnesty International reported that 1,000 Tibetan protesters remained unaccounted for by June 2008. And the CTA reported 5,600 arrests of Tibetans between March 2008 and January the next year, with 1,294 injuries within the same period. Setting himself on fire for protesting this blatant violence operated by the CCP, Monk Tapei wanted to imitate famous monks in Buddhist history who self-immolated by fire protesting for various causes, but did not know very well how to do it. He was saved from death by the police and later appeared, drugged, according to Demick, in CCP propaganda videos where he confessed that he had been manipulated by other Kirti monks to do what he did. So the sad story of monk Tapei is the starting point of the contemporary phenomenon of self-immolation of Tibetans for Tibet, now counting, as I reminded earlier, 169 victims, both within and without Tibet and even China, roughly 1/3 taking place in Gaba or nearby. But why Ngaba? There may be a variety of reasons, but Demick interestingly suggests that the city became the center of these protests because it was the first area populated by Tibetans to experience the massive vexations of the Chinese Communist Army from their first incursions in the area in the 1930s, when the starving Maoist soldiers boiled and ate the skins of the sacred monastery drums and devoted Buddhist figurines after they discovered they were made of barley flour and butter. This is the reason why Demick's book is entitled Eat the Buddha. Chinese communist soldiers also destroyed precious manuscripts and killed monks, and this well before the 1958 campaign and the Cultural Revolution between the year 1966 and 76, with all its horrors. In those old days, armed reaction was a possibility, or many did think it was a possibility. Instead, today, Tibetans think that that option is over, often for very practical reason. Thus, they turn to self-immolations. Self-immolations come chiefly from a religious hope, considering that a non-violent act injuring only the victim and nobody else can change the world. Now, this matter may be discussed at length and in depth, and here specialists of Tibetan Buddhism, which I'm not, have much to comment. As to me, I just want to single out two useful resources. The first is a special issue of Revue d'études tibétain that includes the proceedings of a conference held at the Collège de France in Paris in 2012, available on the internet for free download through the digital Himalaya project, which preserves and makes available historical multimedia materials relating to the Himalaya region. Those studies show a variety of positions on self-immolation and an important debate on the subject, including the attitude of the Dalai Lama, who has tried to express respect for the bravery of the victims while not encouraging the practice, and the theological position of Buddhism on these incidents, which have a long tradition among different Buddhist schools. The second source, which I want to point out, is a 2004 study by Italian philosopher Andrea Di Maio, nothing to do with the same name minister, professor at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and a disciple of the late Italian Jesuit Father Roberto Busa, who is credited as the inventor of the hypertext that we all use today on the internet and in computers. Let me add that Father Busa had no intention to become a cybernetic superstar. He just envisioned the most practical way to reach his goal, that was creating the Index Thomisticus, that is to say, the lemmatization of the complete work by St. Thomas Aquinas, published on the web in 2005. Well, going back to Di Maio's essays on religion and suicide, he carefully distinguishes among martyrdom, suicide, and self-sacrifice, keeping a keen eye also on excesses and fundamentalism. And even if his study concentrates chiefly on Christianity and Islam, his general considerations are certainly useful also to the scholars who wish to explore this matter within a Buddhist context. Let us today move beyond this, and considering self-immolation as a substitute for armored reaction for both practical and religious reasons, let us wonder whether self-immolation do achieve their goal. Again, Demick answers both yes and no. Yes, because self-immolations cause embarrassment to the Chinese authorities, slowing down at some extent the harassment of the Tibetan people. And no, because they give an excuse to the same Chinese authorities to make access to Ngaba more difficult. Truly, this question is for Buddhist theologians as well as for Tibetan sociologists and politicians. Again, as to myself, I wish to conclude moving to my last suggestion. I wish, in fact, to question the morality of self-immolation. I am neither a Tibetan Buddhist nor a Buddhist of any other kind. And of course, I do not want to make any comment that may seem inappropriate or offensive to Buddhists and Tibetans, to my friends, Buddhists and Tibetans. I just want, in fact, to point out that human life, all human life, is sacred. It is given to humans as sacred, and humans have the task to make it also holy. Killing fellow human beings is then a crime, in fact punished by laws and condemned by moral and spiritual authorities. Suicide is also deplorable and morally unacceptable because he or she who commits it ultimately plays on the illusion of being the creator and master of life. Or suicide is the direct consequence of a despair so profound to throw he or she who commits it into the dark abyss of nihilism, where all is nothing and nothing is all. I am not Buddhist, I said. I am a Roman Catholic. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, published in its final form in 1997, it is said that God gives life to humans, and humans are the administrators of the life they are given by God. So man is bound to keep and defend his own life. At the end of his life, man is bound to give back his life to God, who is life's only master. Thus, suicide is contrary to this concept. It is contrary to moral law, and it is even more serious and moral violation when a person commits it to educate others, especially the young. These words, which I just quoted, come from the Catholic Catechism, but I am sure that their essence is valid for every person and every religion or spiritual way. So I continue. Because the very paragraph where the Catholic Catechism indicts suicide as contrary to the moral law also say, quote, grave psychological disturbances, anguish, or grave fear of hardship, suffering, or torture can diminish the responsibility of the one committing suicide. End of quote. I am no theologian. I am a journalist and an observer. I just want to underline that the sacrifice of Tibetans who give their own lives, harming no one else, to raise the conscience of the world in face of the cultural genocide waged against their own people by the CCP, is not motivated by nihilism. Those Tibetan patriots are instead persons who take on themselves the burden of an entire people, singling themselves out as sacrificial lambs. They give away the most important gift that God bestowed upon them to try to stop the harm done to their compatriots by extreme persecutors. They put at the disposal of their neighbors the final, both poorest and most powerful weapon they have at their own disposal, their total self. The Tibetans' last resort is in fact not called suicide, but self-immolation, and this is not just a piece of linguistic sophistry. Because my real question at this point is, and I'm going to finish, who is the real killer in this story? Who is truly responsible for self-immolations of Tibetans? Who armed the hand of Tibetans who set themselves to fire? There is a horrible crime called incitement to suicide. What do you think is the cultural genocide waged on by the CCP in Tibet to wipe entirely out a whole people, if not a form of horrible, continuous violence, one form of which is the incitement to suicide? Westerners, Italians maybe, are familiar with the name of Jan Palach, the Czech student who set himself to fire in 1969 with some companions to protest the invasion of Czechoslovakia, his country, by communist Soviet Union. Palach said to have been inspired by Buddhist monks protesting in Vietnam. Before Palach, in 1968, a Polish protester in Warsaw and the Ukrainian protester in Kiev did the same to similarly challenge communist violence. It was reflecting upon Palach's extreme act that Czech Catholic theologian Father Josef Zverina, interviewed by fellow Czech poet Mary Kričková, said, quote, "It was a testimony, a gesture like when a soldier goes on an assault during the war, or when he is ordered to blow up a bridge and he knows he could face death. That is, it fulfills a moral order. Therefore, it cannot be put on the same level as suicide. It cannot. It must be considered more as a sacrifice of himself, as the cry of pain of an entire people, an unrepeatable gesture, the supreme victim." I thank here Mr. Angelo Bonaguro, Fondazione Russia Cristiana in Italy, for helping me locating this important quotation. Again, I am no one to say whether Father Zvirina was correct. All I know is that first, Father Zvirina and the Dalai Lama seems to share the same view on the topic: admiration for the testimonies of those who immolate themselves, while neither asking nor pushing anyone to do it. Second, before uttering any judgment on single cases and people, all of us, we should always carefully investigate whom the hand which kills belongs to in the former Soviet Empire, as well as in Tibet and China today. And I do hope with this that this may seriously help answering the important question, which is the title of today's webinar. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Marco. I'm really, for me, it's a very first experience to hear a very philosophic background definition and analysis of whether it is self-immolation or suicide. But, when you say that if one person is committing self-immolation, one has to go back and see who is the real culprit behind it. The forces who pressurize, push a person to the extent that one finds so helpless to express himself or herself that finally finds that the only approach is taking one's own life through self-immolation or other way. This. Thank you very much for analyzing this issue from a very fresh angle. And when you raise the question that this is time for the word to ask question, who is the real killer? This I think is one of the basic themes we are meeting today to discuss. If somebody is self-immolating himself or herself, the question is, let us find who is the real killer. And in this case, you gave very good examples of what happened in history, whether it was in Warsaw or in Kiev, and how USSR and the present day China has created those situations where people find the easiest way of expressing themselves in a very, very difficult situation through giving one's own life. Thank you very much, Marco, for this very enlightening analysis. And now I'm coming to our participant, Laron Tethong, who is a very special speaker today for me because I have known her as one of those most active persons who have been reaching out to the world to explain the case of Tibet to the youths of universities across the world and to various action groups, the government agencies, and intellectuals and researchers. Your efforts through Students for Free Tibet or Tibet Action Institute and at personal level have been really noticed and admired, I must say. Uh, I had the privilege, if I can say a very personal note, I had the privilege of being guest of your father, official guest at Mundgud Tibetan settlement in, I think it was 1973 or 1974. And that was the time when I met him. You were not that time born. So I feel very proud that I know a person uh, who gave us a wonderful daughter like you. So, Ladon, we would love to learn from your experience and your analysis of how you look at this spate of self-immolations, which is so big, and still nobody wants to take a notice of it. Now, this is a question which will haunt all of us, and I hope you have the answer. So, Ladon.
Thank you so much, Vijayla. Uh, in the Tibet movement, we really do stand on the shoulders of giants. And we're so fortunate to have, this generation. I'm not the young generation anymore, but somewhere towards the middle. And you really are an inspiration. Your dedication to the Tibetan struggle, the Tibetan quest for freedom is, almost, I would say, unparalleled. And thank you for everything that you do to try to bring our Tibetan struggle for freedom, for human rights, for existence to the world. So thanks, Vijay. I am hiding from my 3 small children right now. It's Saturday morning, and so where I am, and so I apologize. I hope that I've locked myself in a room that I hope they cannot get into. But if you hear screaming, that's why. So sorry about that. I really appreciate, Marco, hearing your thoughts, hearing Lekshila's thoughts, and just analysis of what's happening. This is such a painful topic for Tibetans and our supporters. I think that really the self-immolations have challenged us all over all these years now, since 2009, when Tape, the first known, Tibetan self-immolation inside Tibet happened. I wanted just to address, because I know I've been talking to Tibetan friends and people, as this last Tseon Norbu self-immolated in front of the Potala Palace in Lhasa just weeks ago, really. And then the reports of 2 more self-immolations, Tabun, 81 years old, and another reported Tibetan self-immolation in Tibet just recently. And so I want to just say that, for all of us for this news to sort of be coming out of Tibet again after what was quite a period of sort of quiet, it really has brought up all of this kind of trauma. I think that the there's I feel really conflicting emotions, because on the one hand, I feel horror and anger and sadness that this is happening again, that we're losing more precious Tibetan lives because of China's occupation, because of the inaction of the world. And then at the same time, I feel, excuse me for 1 second. I'm so sorry. My 5-year-old has learned how to use the key to the door. So it is a huge mass of conflicting emotions that Tibetans and Tibet supporters everywhere feel. Because there's also a sense of pride and hope, because Tibetans in Tibet refuse to give up the struggle for freedom despite the violence and the unbelievable daily repression that they live under. And where China thinks that the Chinese authorities think they have closed off every avenue for Tibetans to express themselves and have closed off every avenue of escape from Tibet, which I'll talk a little bit about now. And where the Chinese authorities, Beijing, may think it has the answer in order to control Tibetans and to control their ability to take any political action. We see Tibetans taking the ultimate sacrifice in order to express themselves in the worst possible situation and in the most, painful way, but they are not, they refuse to be controlled. Where China attempts to have total control, Tibetans in a way demonstrate through this terribly upsetting and painful action that at the end of the day, you cannot control the human spirit and the heart. You cannot control the Tibetan desire for freedom, no matter what. And so that is, also just a very powerful message of hope and determination coming from inside Tibet. So it really is, it's complicated. And I just want to acknowledge how this feels for Tibetans everywhere and supporters in the world who are watching, because I know for me, it's a challenge. Why though? Why this is happening? If I could just talk about the situation in Tibet right now and how it has deteriorated, because I think for so long we've talked about the terrible conditions inside Tibet, the repression, the violence. We've seen it's been bad for so long, for decades and decades. But actually, these recent times, we really see China has stepped up under Xi Jinping, has stepped up and accelerated the attack and sort of the final elimination project or campaign inside of Tibet. And I just want to talk about a couple aspects of that. I think it's important, people do not hear Tibet mentioned so often in the news anymore. Even the stories of the self-immolations are so hard to get the information out, whereas some 10 years ago, we had photos, we had videos coming out, there was footage, we could actually see and hear what the situation on the ground was like inside Tibet. And now it's not the case. If you can just think for a moment, the 25-year-old Tsewan Norbu self-immolated in front of the Potala Palace in Lhasa, in the capital city of Tibet, in front of what is perhaps the most iconic structure, most well-known structure in Tibet. And at the most, sort of heightened political moment, we know that hundreds of people must have witnessed what happened. And in this day and age where everyone has their phone and everyone has an internet connection and the ability to transmit information, and we see documentation of everything everywhere, whether we want to see it or not, online on social media, it took us 3 weeks, I think, to confirm what happened. That shows the level of control and the level of the climate of fear that exists in Tibet today, that those Tibetans and people who would have witnessed this action would not be able to share it, or felt that they couldn't share it, or were intimidated, and actually targeted so that they wouldn't, or that the networks were blocked, or that the data was, blocked from being sent out, that it took 3 weeks to confirm. And he's not just any average person in a sense. He's a pop star. He's a Tibetan pop star. He's a famous figure for the youth, the people, the very ones who are most active on social media and online and able to document in a second what is happening in their lives and in their surroundings. But that speaks to the information blackout and the total lockdown of Tibet. And this has really been enforced since 2008, since the uprising that started in March in Tibet across all 3 historical provinces of Tibet, not just what China calls Tibet, which is Tibet Autonomous Region or Central Tibet, but all of historical Tibet saw a massive uprising and challenge to Beijing's rule and China's occupation of Tibet, starting in March of 2008. And since that time, the crackdown has been, the level to which the Chinese have taken the repression. If you can think back in 2008, up until that moment, an average of 2,200 Tibetans escaped every year on foot over the Himalayan mountains into Nepal and India. So that incredibly difficult, deadly journey, over 2,000 Tibetans annually made that escape attempt and made it successfully. We don't know how many didn't make it. That number has gone to a trickle now because of surveillance, because of increased patrols, because of pressure in the border area of Nepal and in Nepal itself, political pressure by the Chinese, retaliation, threats to local people to help Tibetans escape, because of pressure back in Tibet in the villages, and just the total surveillance and use of drones and just at the highest mountain passes, stepped up surveillance to keep Tibetans locked in this prison that is Tibet. I think the last couple of years we have seen like 5 Tibetans escape successfully from Tibet this way. So you have Tibetans in Tibet, they can't even escape. They certainly can't get passports to leave. The restrictions on movement inside Tibet are stepped up completely, whereas Tibetans from Eastern Tibet used to be able to go easily, more easily to go on pilgrimage to Central Tibet, to the Chokhang, to Lhasa. Suddenly the control on people just to be able to move around in Tibet is really off the charts. And then at the same time, you have people inside Tibet who now they're at they could have a more serious punishment and a longer prison sentence for sharing information about a protest or news of some act, something that's happened in their region. They could have a harsher punishment for sharing the information than actually engaging in the protest itself. So the message is clear. You will not communicate what is happening in Tibet. If you communicate with people outside of Tibet and tell them what is the true situation on the ground, you will face unbelievably harsh punishment, and your entire community and family could face unbelievably harsh punishment. So the level of, for 2 years in a row now, for Freedom House to document and to rank Tibet as the number one least free place on earth, next to Syria, tied with Syria in their global ranking of civil and political liberties in the world. It's astounding, considering how little we hear about Tibet on the news from the mouths of, governments and world leaders. And yet that's the real picture. That's what's happening. And so this incredible climate of fear and repression, total lockdown of Tibet, and that people can't even escape. And then what's happening inside, what's going on inside that blackout. And I just want to tell the story of this report we released recently. One element of this, but a cornerstone of this sort of accelerated campaign to eliminate Tibetan identity, or genocide, from Xi Jinping in the central from Beijing. So we were hearing in the last couple of years, of course, more and more about Tibetan language under attack inside Tibet, and more students, schools. It's always very complicated to try to track exactly what's happening where, because China has so effectively chopped Tibet up into different administrative regions and speaks about one area as a part of this province, and this is Tibet, and this is a prefecture. So policies are implemented sometimes on different timelines in different ways. And so it's complicated, and it's a real challenge to try to understand what is happening when and where inside Tibet on top of the information blackout. But we've been hearing more and more about Tibetans children being sent to boarding schools at an alarmingly high rate and against the wishes of their parents, and more young people. Excuse me for 1 second.
We love children, don't we? So no problem.
Apologies. I think that may be it. This is the challenge of a house with multiple young children running around and only one caregiver. Apologies. And that's my 5-year-old, and I have to say, my work on colonial boarding schools, and we were hearing more and more about 4 and 5-year-olds being sent to boarding school. 4 and 5-year-olds. I mean, really very young children against their parents' wishes. These were the reports we were getting from Tibet. And we were so unbelievably disturbed by what we were hearing. We decided we had to look into this. Though the information is very difficult to find, we were able to piece together a picture of 800 to 900,000 Tibetan children between the ages of 6 and 18 now living in colonial boarding schools, a massive network of colonial boarding schools inside all of historical Tibet, separated from their families, separated from their communities. And that 800 to 900,000 number, 6 to 18-year-olds, represents 80% of all Tibetan children that age. And that does not include an unknown number of 4 and 5-year-olds in boarding preschools, because China knows boarding preschools are wrong and they are hiding them. So we know about what they call kindergarten, or more and more Tibetan children being sent to preschool and kindergarten in sort of the cities, in the few real urban areas in Tibet, and their day schools. But we are now certain that a huge number of little ones are being sent to boarding preschools in rural areas. And what happens at these schools? They do not get to study in Tibetan language. They have to study now, all of them, in Mandarin, in Chinese. Tibetan class, they may have one Tibetan class. So the vast majority of their very long days is in Chinese. They're subjected to intense political indoctrination, really intense political indoctrination, even the littlest ones, that says the Chinese Communist Party and China is above everything. And that is where your loyalty should be and must be. And that is to whom you owe everything, to the party, really, Tibetans. And then at the same time, their entire curriculum, where before in Tibet, at least Tibetan intellectuals, academics, education policy people, Tibetans in the education system across all of Tibet and at every level, had fought to have some level of Tibetan content in the curriculum for many, many years. Now the curriculum is it's a Chinese curriculum. It's about China's history and culture. Tibetan history and culture is nowhere, absolutely nowhere in there. And because you're not living in your community, these kids, with their families, they have no access to Tibetan Buddhism, none. Because you're not allowed to practice religion in China in school and state-run anything. And so if you're living the majority of your life separated from your family and your community, then where is your normal Buddhist upbringing, and where is any of your exposure to true, authentic Tibetan religion and culture? Nowhere, not in your daily life. And so we're talking about, if there are 7 million Tibetans inside of all of Tibet and some parts of China, we're talking now with the 4 and 5-year-olds about 1 in every 7 Tibetans living in the state's control in these so-called schools. And they're really about identity transformation. This is from the highest levels of the Chinese government, Communist Party, Xi Jinping. This is, these new ethnic unity policies ethnic unity sounds maybe like a good idea, but really it is about replacing Tibetan identity with a Chinese identity. And parents have no choice but to send their children to these schools. People say to us, how are the Chinese forcing Tibetans to go to these schools? Tibetans aren't just sending their kids. Well, really, parents have no options, because the Chinese government has closed the village and the local schools. If you want your child to get an education, And Tibetan parents want their children to be educated. The world around them is changing so quickly. They know that their children need to have a modern education in order to survive, and not just to survive, but do well. That's what every parent wants for their child. And that's what Tibetan parents want too. But in order for them to get an education, they have to send them often far away. At very young ages, they can't live with them. And if they try to resist, if they try to say no, they're threatened, they're punished, they're harassed, called constantly if someone figures out that there's a young child over in that remote area that doesn't seem to have been enlisted in school yet. And whole communities can be punished if they don't follow, if they try to put up any resistance to sending their little ones away. And so Tibetan parents, in the situation Tibetans have been in all these years, and when a policy is being driven from the highest levels, like this one is, you do not say no. Or if you do, you know you will be, even though all you're trying to do is keep your child at home and near to you where you can protect them and watch over them, where they can wreak chaos in your life, whatever it is, just as a parent, whatever you're trying to do, if you resist this kind of policy, you can be and will be accused of some very serious political crime, because you are somehow challenging the state and undermining the power of the state, or trying to. And so it is an absolutely desperate situation, because the reports that we are hearing, Tibetan children are losing their ability to speak in Tibetan language at a very young age. And a Tibetan education policy expert that we do work with now is talking about how the 4 and 5-year-olds, the preschools, really targeting these very young children at the sort of foundation, where their identity is being cemented and their psychological sort of foundation is being set, to take them so young away from their families, and then to have them not just speak in Chinese, but close their eyes and imagine Chinese cultural objects and how they would use those objects. All of this is a very dangerous plan to really try to change Tibetans from the inside. So that soon we may have, in combination with the pressure on the monasteries, the closing of monastery schools, not allowing monks and nuns to join the monasteries at young ages, the controls on the practice of Tibetan Buddhism. Of course, we know about their plans for the future of Tibetan Buddhism and the reincarnation or the succession of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. In combination with those policies, in combination with policies that are removing Tibetan nomads from the grasslands and really attacking the traditional Tibetan way of life, and the way of life of rural people. Vast majority of Tibet is rural. So all of these taken together, and in this intense climate of repression, this is genocide. The future of Tibet is at risk right now in a way like never before, because it's from every direction. It's so thorough. And as we have seen with residential schools and the history of residential schools, these boarding schools in places like Canada and Australia and the US, but especially I can speak to Canada because I am Tibetan Canadian. I was born and raised in Canada. Residential schools did more to damage and fundamentally change and hurt, cause immense suffering to First Nations and other Native people in Canada in a way that, you can't reverse that. You can work as First Nations people in Canada have done to rebuild, to fight back, to regain some of what was lost. And to, obviously that's what's happening. That's the only reason why there's been a huge reckoning. But the damage is long lasting, and the damage is painfully permanent on some level. And that is why the colonial boarding schools in Tibet right now, this entire generations of Tibetans being raised outside of the Tibetan, not just family and community, but the entire Tibetan cultural context and foundation, they threaten the future survival of Tibet. And Tibetans inside Tibet know it. Tibetans feel this pressure at every level. And that is, I think, also, we've been hearing more and more from inside Tibet that I fear we'll see more self-immolations, because I think we're in this desperate situation right now. And people inside are not giving up. 70 years. And I think that is also one of the keys. Maybe I'll close with this. 70 years of occupation in Tibet, unbelievable violence, unbelievable repression. Tibetans have not stopped fighting. Even a new generation, which is what 2008 showed us, a new generation entirely raised under the Chinese Communist Party with no memory of a free or independent Tibet. They've never seen His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. Even in 2008, we saw, and since then, young Tibetans fighting back, saying, we're Tibetan. We are proud of who we are. Tibetans should be united. We should fight. Don't give up. Messages of hope. We hear that from a lot of the self-immolator, those Tibetans who've self-immolated. Messages of hope, looking to the future, calls for unity. So the determination and the commitment and all of those elements are there. And I think even if you put all these young Tibetans into these schools and remove the language from their tongues and change them in some ways, at the end of it all, Tibetans are not Chinese. And they will leave these schools and go into the real world, and of course have that message reinforced to them every day because of the intense racism from China and Chinese society and the way Chinese look at Tibetans. And they will know they're not Chinese, but they will unfortunately not have all of the Tibetan cultural sort of foundation and strength there to draw on. But they will fight, and they will fight for their rights, because that's what Tibetans have been doing for generations. And that's what people do. You know, this is the story of colonialism. This is the story of when you try to keep a people down and deny them what is theirs, you know, their basic fundamental human rights. People will fight back, and the next coming generations of Tibetans will too, and they will find a way. And so my question, you know, to me, it's like we have to work now to end China's repression in Tibet, to call this genocide and fight against it on every level in the international community, because an attempted genocide, because the damage and the suffering that is being done is immeasurable, and that has got to stop. But in the end, I think the message to Tibetans is that though this is a very painful and difficult time, it's not the end. The Chinese government has done many terrible and highly destructive, you know, implemented highly destructive policies in Tibet through 70 years, and Tibetans never stop, and they won't stop now. But how much damage will be done and how much suffering, that's the question. And that's what we have to work to end as soon and as quickly as possible. Thank you. Sorry for the disruption.
Oh, thank you, Lauren. Thank you. No, it was not disruption. Rather, I would interpret it in a very different way. I think it's a compliment to you, to the Tibetan spirit, that we see here the director of Tibet Action Institute working for her nation, for the freedom of her country, and handling little kids, and still participating in an international discussion. I think it's a compliment, and let me thank your little child to draw this point home. So thank you very much, Ladon. It was very enlightening the way you have explained. You know, it worries us. You know, when I say us, of course, it means those people who understand Tibet a little bit, and even it worries those people who have yet to understand the magnitude of the damage communist system is doing to a culture, to people. And it's not only Tibetans. They are doing it to the Uyghurs. They are doing it to the Mongols in South Mongolia. They have already done it to the Manchurians. They have done it. Manchurians are unfortunately done. You know, there is no case now, no language, no people to speak that language. And now they are going to do it in Hong Kong. So I think your presentation is an eye-opener for even those people who don't care for Tibet, but those people who care for humanity, who care for the Hong Kong people, who care for Uyghurs, who care for Mongols, who care for ordinary Chinese. The way you explained that since Xi Jinping has come, the process of brainwashing has taken new dimensions. I think this is a subject we would love to discuss one day exclusively in another webinar, because it's a subject which cannot be just discussed in as in one person's presentation. So you have given us a new subject, new idea, that how China is brainwashing a little babies, the entire culture, to wipe out the identity of Tibetans. This needs word attention. But at the same time, you have given a new hope that whatever China did in last 72 years in China, in Tibet, those generations who never saw Dalai Lama, who never heard of a Tibetan government, who don't have any inkling of what was free Tibet. And 3 generations after that, there are young people who are taking to self-immolation, like Tsewang Norbu does it. This shows your that part of presentation gives a hope to those people who believe that the identity of cultures, identity of nations deserve to be protected. And men like Xi Jinping or Communist Party of China are a threat not only to China, they are a threat to the human race. Thank you very much for making this presentation. Now I think this is time to open our discussion for question and answers. I hope our friend Ayushi Ketkar is here with us, and she must have picked up a few questions. We have I think only 10 minutes or so. We should finish these questions in that time. Ayushi Ketkar.
Thank you, sir. Uh, so, without further ado, let me jump into the questions directly. Ladonga, very, very interesting issues that you've raised. Okay, and these are not just human rights issues, but they go beyond it. In fact, they touch various realms: the political and the non-political aspects. The first question definitely is on this colonial boarding schools that you've mentioned. I think this is a uh, very serious matter, which, as Vijay sir rightly said, requires deep attention, and not just in terms of research, but in terms of action as well. Because under the garb of unity, the policy of unity, what China is actually trying to do is undertake a homogeneity project, where the very identity and the very basis of nationhood is lost, because it's these young impressionable minds which are being targeted. So do you see this as a political form of genetic engineering, as they say? This is something which can cause a lasting damage, not only to an individual, but to the entire cause of nationhood. So I would like your further comments on this issue. Although you've very nicely elaborated on it, but do you see this as some kind of genetic engineering in that sense? Another very important issue that you've raised was of information blackout and censorship of the media. We live in a free world, and in such an era, when you're talking of information blackout, it's again a very serious discussion. Does it bring us back to that age old concept of social contract, where human beings entered or created the state by giving away a part of their freedom in the hope of security? And here you see both of it being compromised in a big way. There's there's further insecurity, and even you've lost your freedom. So does this bring us to that basic debate of why states are formed, or what is the basic function of a state? So I would like you to comment on this. And Marco, sir, you, for the first time in a very political charged discussion on Tibet, you've brought in theology, which is very interesting per se. This entire debate between suicide versus sacrifice, I think that was really You brought in a new perspective altogether. But I am a political scientist. Unfortunately, I'll narrow down your focus. And do you see this? Like in India, we had a great freedom fighter in the form of Mahatma Gandhi, who speaks, I mean, whose entire philosophy, the way he fought the battle for freedom, was through satyagraha, sticking to the truth, and civil disobedience. So do you see this? I'm just trying to get you out of this suicide versus sacrifice thing. And if without getting into the intricacies of theology, do you see this? Oh, I see you showing something, probably. Yeah. So do you see this as an extreme form of civil disobedience? So that is a question for you. And Vijay sir, you've mentioned something very interesting. I would have two questions for you, in fact two comments from you. One was actually directed to Tenzin La. He makes a very important mention of how Chinese want Tibet but not Tibetans. Okay. So again, I would like you to comment on whether you can get a nation, you can get a nation with just the territory and leaving the people part aside, because we always believe that these are two very important concepts of nation, or nation state in that matter. So can you just have the territory? I know as for territory of Tibet, it's a very valuable thing, because it's a resource rich land, both in terms whether it's hydro or minerals. In every which way, Tibet is a resource rich land. And even in terms of connectivity, the geopolitical importance of it, all said and done, can you have a place without the people? And second, you rightly mentioned the way you started, how a common man, or in fact, you gave a very nice example of Vietnam and how saints led the movement. Here also in Tibet, you see a lot of immolations being taken place, either by monks, nuns. In that sense, you have the spiritual people taking the lead. And rightly said how Arab Spring, there was that one vendor, brave vendor, Mohammad Bouazizi, who actually led that, who caused the entire Arab Spring. So the importance of people and saints, spiritual leaders in the freedom struggle. This is important because our Prime Minister Modi also makes a mention of it in this Amrit Mahotsav. He says how saints have played an important role in India in the freedom struggle. So, I would like you to relate this to Tibet as well. So these are the questions from my side. Thank you.
Yeah. So first, Ladunla, you first questions were to you, and then Marco, and we conclude with my whatever I can answer.
Yeah, I'll try to just really quickly say the Chinese authorities, Xi Jinping, this is an ethnic elimination project. This is to whether Tibetans, Uyghurs, Southern Mongolian, this is about eliminating resistance and dissent by eliminating, what it is that makes these groups and people different. And for us, it's not just some cultural differences to Chinese. We are a independent nation under illegal occupation with a long independent history and knowledge, deep knowledge and understanding of who we are as separate from China, whoever's in power in China. And so for Tibetans, it's really clear this is not about, I think words like assimilation and they're too gentle. Even forced assimilation sounds, not as bad as what I believe is happening. As one Tibetan education policy expert has said, to us, this is, in a way, they're trying to end Tibetan civilization, because it's not just the children. It's not just the next generation that they're trying to eliminate their identity and replace it with Chinese identity. They're at the highest levels and in higher academic studies. You cannot really study in Tibetan anymore. They've amalgamated the Tibetan studies, the Uyghur studies, the Southern, the Mongolian studies programs at the university level, so that all of those Tibetans who were able to pursue, Tibetan language, culture, history to some degree, they now have to study together. They have to take their classes together, and that means they have to do it all in Mandarin. And there's no place for them to go and take their curriculum or any of the content that they could develop that would be Tibetan or Mongolian or Uyghur. So, you have the pressure from both sides as well as out in society to fundamentally change Tibetans into something that they are not. And this is what it's about. And at the same time, I just have to be clear, Tibetans, China has no legitimacy. Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party, has no legitimacy in Tibet, no matter what they've tried to do over 70 years. This is an occupation by force. China rules in Tibet by force. And if you remove that, if you take away the military, if you take away the punishment and take away the ability for them to imprison Tibetans and to torture Tibetans and to force Tibetans to do what they want, Tibetans will be Tibetan. Their allegiance is to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's to Tibetan leaders. It's to Tibetan spiritual teachers, not to Beijing. And Beijing knows this, and that's why they're doing it. So Tibetans are not citizens of the People's Republic of China. That's clear. Tibetans are subjects. I'll just end there.
Thank you. Now, Marco.
Yes, thank you. It is a very important question, and it will take so much to answer properly to this question that we may need another webinar. But as a matter of fact, I'm pretty much interested in political science and politics. This is not to justify my speech, but I do thought and think that something like self-immolation needed to be addressed also from a moral standpoint, because it is so extreme a gesture that may be debatable. Also within Buddhism is debated. So again, it is not to justify my speech, but I thought proper to point out a few questions on a moral level, maybe philosophical, maybe even theological. And I think I was pretty clear with my rhetorical question at the end, asking who is the real responsible for those deaths. And, it's the CCP, of course. So I really wanted to distinguish suicide as we understand suicide from self-immolation. I just wanted to draw this difference. But your question pointed out civil disobedience. To study these important testimonies. There is a long tradition of civil disobedience going back maybe to the older Roman Empire, through the early, at least in the West, from the early Christian ages, going to Henri David Thoreau in the more recently in America, and to people like Gandhi. Let me tell you that I totally respect people like Gandhi, Thoreau, and all this long tradition who use civil disobedience as the fundamental form of protest when injustice comes out. But I think that this is why I say we need to discuss this more at length. I think that pacifism as such may have some flaws and may have some limits. Look at, we have an example in our eyes today. Look at Ukraine. What would you say to Ukrainian people? Just stop there and let the Russian kill you? Of course not. So I totally respect civil disobedience. I strongly advocate civil disobedience and peaceful demonstrations as much as possible, and even further. But it comes time when, for example, Ukraine, when you really need to be much more realistic. And I think that if you study properly Gandhi, he said kind of these things. Civil disobedience worked out because he had the British in front of him. If you had the Chinese or the Soviets, that may be totally different. So again, total respect for civil disobedience. I think we all should use civil disobedience and peaceful manifestation and demonstration as much as possible. But it comes a time when something else may be needed. I'm not advocating war. I hate war. War is horrible. War is a bad thing. But you know Tibetan history more than better than I do, and you know that when the Dalai Lama was compelled to flee Tibet, he was accompanied by some armed monks because he had to defend him. And civil disobedience, this is my last sentence, civil disobedience is a wonderful value. We should always do that. But it comes a time when if my family is attacked, I need maybe to do something else. Going back to self-immolations, I think I have the same position of the Dalai Lama on this subject. I'm admiring those heroes and martyrs, even if maybe I'm not advocating doing that. I mean, I really would hope that self-immolation become unnecessary, and this comes only with stopping the CCP occupation of Tibet, a foreign country, and the cultural genocide there.
Yeah, it seems there is some connectivity problem. So let us take it forward. Your point was made, and I could, even as an Indian, I got a very good perspective, a fresh perspective of self-obedience, self or civil disobedience, especially in the context of when you say of the Roman history. Thank you very much about it. I will handle the two questions you Ayushi put to me, and then that will be concluding. Uh, the very first question, Tenzin Lixie said that China wants Tibet and it doesn't want Tibetans. This, I think he has defined the whole political process or the entire history of past 72 years in one sentence. I agree with him when he says China wants Tibet because Tibet has land. Tibet has natural resources. Tibet is the richest place of water, and that too pure water, drinkable water, potable water in the whole world. And as it's a supply house to half of Asia, it is full of minerals which are very, very precious. And today, especially when it comes to, when we see the China's prosperity, if you look at it, just very simple calculation, the areas it has occupied of Tibet, of East Turkestan, which we call Xinjiang, and South Mongolia, they account for more than 52% of present day People's Republic of China by land. But they account for two-thirds, more than 66% of natural resources which China is enjoying today and exploiting. So that explains why China needs these lands, why China does not need the people. Because for China, Tibetans are a liability, Uyghurs are a liability, Mongols are a liability, but their assets, their land is an asset. So that's why they want it. And I think world has to understand that when China, when the world governments many times, I don't know why they start referring to one China policy, agreeing to China, and then also saying that we don't interfere in internal matters. They treat Tibet, Xinjiang, South Mongolia as internal matters. I think this is one of the worst crimes world governments are doing today. They are not only acknowledging and certifying Chinese illegal occupation of these countries, they are also functioning as an accomplice by number one, not interfering, and number two, not opposing it. So that explains why China wants Tibet and not Tibetans. And the world must understand, because ultimately China is using the resources of these countries against the rest of world. Coming to the role of monks, I would say in short, you rightly mentioned the role of monks in Indian freedom struggle. Uh, in India, the monks uh, belong to that class who have given up their worldly possessions, which puts them in a very advantageous position also. They have nothing to lose and they have only to contribute. So that is how, when you see the movements in India, in many parts of India, where the saints, they took up arms also, they led the people also, and they played a big role in the freedom of India. Once in my one of my discussions with His Holiness Dalai Lama, I had my way of thinking in that age. I was very young at that time. I know him for last 50 years. In very early days, I asked him a very foolish question: why Tibet should have so many monks? They are unproductive. They are not contributing. They are only sitting and praying. So I asked this question, and he smiled, and he explained in his own way, in very short. His answer was that they are not, working in, you can say, a factory or an office, but because they are not doing that work, so they have bigger chances to contribute more and contribute those things which people working in factories, which people working in offices cannot. So here I find no surprise when you see, if you make a list of those Tibetans who have committed self-immolation since 2009, you will be surprised to see that more than half of them are monks and nuns, which shows that these individual Tibetans who may have given up the word as we look at it, but they have not given up their Tibetan spirit. So they have more to contribute. They have contributed that way in a very big way. And those friends who know the history of pre 1959, between 1951 and 1959, it was the monks, it was the monasteries who took up arms against the invading Chinese army. So they were the biggest force behind the freedom movement of Tibet. So that is how I look at it. And I hope uh, our subject today has been useful for our friends who have been in the audience, those who will be watching it on YouTube later. And today, the vote of thanks was to be given by our friend, Mr. Gompo Thundup, the president of Tibetan Youth Congress. But on the last moment, he had to take a journey, and so that's why he could not participate. On his behalf and on behalf of Chase, I thank our participants, Marco Respinti. I thank Laron Tetong. I thank Tenzin Lekshe for participation. And thank you very much, Ayushi, for, as always, adding energy to the webinar in the form of questions and answers. And my special thanks to our friend Thaila, who is on behalf of Tibet Action Institute, who is helping always these webinars through technical support. So thank you very much. And I'm sure we are going to meet very soon again. And our next program will be on 25th of April, which happens to be the 33rd birth anniversary of 11th Panchal Lama, who still remains untraced, somewhere under the control of China, somewhere under his occupation, Chinese occupation, and where China has refused to give any information about him. So on 25th April, we'll meet again with a new subject, and the subject will be about Panchen Lama, and through Panchen Lama, how China is trying to put its control over the religious system. We'll handle at that time. So thank you very much, everybody, and we meet again. Namaskar. Good morning, good evening, and good night to our friends. Namaskar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.